From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Chung, and this matters. If you spend any time walking through Toronto streets, its many neighborhoods, you're bound to hear dozens of different languages. People of all different backgrounds call Toronto home. They've carved out pockets of space, of businesses and culture that in many ways makes this city what it is. How much of that was planned, and how much of it was just organic? The City of Toronto is proposing a cultural districts plan for different neighborhoods. The details aren't fully defined yet, but the idea is that a neighborhood like Little Jamaica would be officially designated by the city as a place to be preserved. But there's lots of people who live in those neighborhoods or who run businesses there asking, who is this for? If Chinatown on Spadina Avenue has stood on its own and developed for decades, what's being added by officially calling it a cultural district, and what's actually being preserved? On This Matters, we're joined by Danica Samuel, reporter for the Toronto Star. Danica has been reporting on all the proposed changes from the cultural districts plan, asking questions of the city on what the end goal here is. We'll talk about how a city grows and changes over the years, and who gets to decide that. Danica, great to have you here. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You know, one of the biggest points of pride for Toronto is in how we see ourselves, in how the city sells itself. It's multiculturalism. The City of Toronto, that's the municipal government side, is now looking into this cultural districts plan. So what exactly is it? How has it defined that idea?
So there's two parts to this. I could give my interpretation and then I could give what the city is telling me. So I'll start off with what the city is saying, and is obviously long and short. But the short of it is the city sees cultural districts as a formal plan to celebrate and to support some of the ethnic enclaves in the city of Toronto, or any of the enclaves that have provided the city with such vibrance in whatever culture it is, or whatever community it is. And so they're utilizing a cultural district as a way to navigate around some of the archaic policies that are set in place to support those communities. And my interpretation of it is just like another red tape to kind of have these communities marginalized, but in a fluffier way. And I say that because I feel like the policies that are in place should be just broken down, but instead we're finding other ways around it and making, something that happened organically in Toronto more formal.
Right. So that's where maybe the red tape comes in by putting this label on it to something that already exists. You see it as maybe another roadblock, another piece of red tape for these communities, for these neighborhoods.
Yeah, because essentially in October, when Elena Bird, I believe her title is one of the policy officers around city planning, when she did the presentation on cultural districts, one of the things that she was mentioning is that they want it to be a program where there's some form of a committee or a board that gets to facilitate what qualifies and what identifies as a cultural district. And so essentially, like, these communities will now apply to get recognized as one and then get the benefits of what a cultural district would get underneath this new program guideline. And to me, that sounds like red tape for these communities. Because when you think about just going back on what Toronto prided itself on with that multiculturalism, there was not this red tape. There was not this formalization of what Kensington Market was. There wasn't a formalization of what Chinatown was. It just was. It just is that.
It just grew organically. These communities sprouted up there. Yeah.
Yeah, and communities evolve too, right? I mean, Kensington Market is a perfect example of, we've seen the Portuguese, we've seen Jewish community, we've seen the Chinese community, we've seen the Caribbean community all up and through Kensington Market. And there's still remnants of that nuance of all those different flavors from across the globe in Kensington Market. And it's communal. So by taking that and saying, you have to now go through this process so that we could protect and preserve what you brought to the city, it could be quite a tricky one. It could be quite a tricky one for the community to not see that as a layer of red tape to preserve something that is their DNA.
Now, this plan for cultural districts from the city, it was announced at the Economic Development Committee at the city level. And so it's worth asking, is this about the economic development of an area or is it about preserving the community that already exists there? Is that part of the discussion that's happening between people who live there and urban planners too?
I think in order to go and dissect how this term was introduced, you have to take it months back to when at the start, myself and my editor Priya, when we broke the story of, the 50 years of neglect of Little Jamaica. And that specific community, prior to a lot of the coverage has been about the downfall of that neighborhood based on the LRT construction, on gentrification as a whole. And cultural districts was introduced earlier in the year as a rebuttal to heritage conservation district for that area. And so what happened was initially there was a community meeting and the city planning department said that, a heritage conservation district is not a good fit for Little Jamaica. And that kind of erupted in a lot of community advocates and a lot of, people on Twitter saying, how could they determine that when the community has been there since the 70s or 60s? And so I think the city planning department team tried to, and the city overall was trying to gather themselves and find a way that they could work around these archaic policies to appease the Little Jamaica community without changing the law. And that's how cultural districts came to be. And so when it was first introduced, it was just, we don't think heritage conservation district is the right thing. We think a cultural district is, but there was no definition.
Okay, so when the city came back to say, okay, let's call it a cultural district instead, there was no official definition on what that actually even meant.
Yeah, and that's the thing, there still is no hard definition of it. There is this floating sort of a concept that they're taking from maybe one city, they're studying San Francisco and Singapore and Boston, but there isn't a Toronto definition of what a cultural district is. But I think that they know culture existed in Little Jamaica, and that's where it becomes like a red tape. So instead of giving the people what they want, they just focused on making a cultural district. So when the pushback happened, a motion was passed by Josh Matlow to survey the area for heritage conservation, and that was passed. And so people were very pleased about it. But then again, the city of Toronto backpedaled and doubled down and said that they want to focus on going the cultural district route, despite there not being a definition of it. So when you fast forward to this economic development committee meeting, the introduction of the cultural district, they're pegging it as, well, because of what we're seeing is happening in Little Jamaica, we want to use it as this guinea pig to determine what we're going to do for the other communities that are, similar to Little Jamaica's culture.
We'll be right back. And urban planners you interviewed in your reporting about this story have flagged some issues with the cultural district plan. And as it currently stands, we should add that details are still being filled in. As we record this, they are still sort of in that consultation phase. But what red flags are urban planners that you talk to? What kind of flags have they thrown up about this?
Yeah, so the red flags that there's several, but I think the one main one is who determines the culture? I think that is really a concern for urban planners, because when you put in a formalized system for any communities or for any group of people, you're potentially ghettoizing. And I believe it was a quote by James Baldwin about, urban planning or, certain changes that cities do is a way to push out people of the African diaspora through gentrification and through other means. He mentioned that urban renewal is just a way to suppress and to keep Black people out of certain communities. And I think the same is applicable for other ethnicities. So when you do this urban renewal strategy, you create these districts, essentially what you're doing is you're putting in this extra layer of red tape of someone they have to answer to about just simply existing in their community. And that's what begs the question, who gets to decide this? Who gets to determine what qualifies as a, cultural district? And who gets to determine the rules and the regulations and the policies that go into it? And what is the basis of that decision making? And another red flag for them is the zoning. How does zoning partake in this? We have a lot of issues with zoning in Toronto specifically, and that is a concern about how is that going to work with cultural districts. We already have BIAs, and they're saying that cultural districts are supposed to be separate from that, but it's hard to see how we're having all these districts now going to be around Toronto and how zoning is still going to be effective or not effective. And the last but not the least red flag is policies. I think that from the beginning, when we start to have the conversations around preserving heritage and heritage conservation districts, it was policies. A lot of Ontario and Canada's policies are very archaic and they're very much skewed to an Anglo-Saxon sort of identity within our country. And one of the excuses that keeps coming up with heritage conservation is that, oh, they study the architecture and the physicality of the buildings and the area. They don't focus on the culture or what the people bring to it. And it's easy for someone like you and I to say, like, okay, well, then let's just change the policies. But apparently that seems to be the hardest thing. It's one of the extra red tapes, the big fat red tapes that we probably see in our Canadian flag that is actually going to be in front of us to change those policies. So I think that is a major concern of the urban planners too, because it's more of a now you're tango with the policies rather than you're just, abolishing it and revisiting those laws that keep us in the way we are in Toronto.
You're talking about how these communities are formally, or they are being formalized and now have to directly deal with policies and perhaps explain to city officials why that sign should be up, why this building should look this way, what the street should look like. It will become a much more formalized process, which might not work so well.
Yeah. And, they haven't set in stone what that process looks like. Again, the city has been clear that they're still talking to community members or individuals for research. And it still isn't really clear who they're speaking with for this research, but they said that they're talking to community members about it. So they're still building out this process. But you're very much right about, having to go through this formal plan. And I think that it doesn't leave room for evolution, really and truly, because when you start to say, okay, well, we put this policy in Little Jamaica that you guys get to do this as a cultural district, when the generations that come of an African diaspora, the Caribbean diaspora in a neighborhood, they want to see a change, they might find themselves stuck in what the policy was at the time that people before them have put in place. Things are constantly changing and growing across the globe, and migration is changing too. So it's difficult. It is really difficult to put a community in that kind of predicament and to say that it's a way to celebrate them and it's to say that it's a way to, preserve their culture, their heritage there. I think that, for lack of a better word, you're just playing in people's faces, to be honest, because there are so many ways that you could celebrate and protect and preserve a community without having them prove that they are worthy of some kind of cultural district label.
Right. And especially these communities, we're talking about racialized communities when it comes to these cultural districts, oftentimes marginalized. And so it's an important question to ask. Are they actually being represented? Are they the ones leading that conversation, especially when they have arguably the biggest stake in whether or not something like this works or fails?
Yeah, and that was one of the great things that one of the urban planners from Urban Strategies, Jamila Mohammed, I hope I pronounced her last name correct, she basically was saying that, if something like this is to materialize and to come into full effect, it can't be something that comes from top down. It really has to be the community that gets to delegate and determine this. And I frankly don't see how that will work in Toronto, but I tried to keep some optimism around it. But in the past, we have seen that it is quite a fight to get it to work from a community up direction rather than a top down.
So this all filters to maybe a more ultimate question of who is this program for? Who is the cultural district program for? Is it for the city and their economic development and how they want to define certain neighborhoods? Is it for the residents in each of these neighborhoods? Does it depend on who you ask? I know it seems like a big question, but do we have any sense of who this is ultimately for?
Well, the way they're pegging it in the presentation is that it is for the communities. It's a way to preserve and celebrate and to make sure that the city of Toronto is supporting these communities, as much as they can. And that's where they're kind of leaving it at. It is obviously questionable that it's being shown at the Economic Development and Committee meeting because it probably does have something to do with the economy in a way that hasn't been fully shared with, everyone. But they did say that they will be sharing it in Q3 next year. But as of right now, it's very much in the preliminary stages, and they're pegging this cultural district as a benefit to community members, as a way to kind of keep the government accountable with this new program by saying, hey, we're officially a cultural district. And so we deserve these things. These are the policies that, should be in place in our communities. I don't know who else it would be benefiting. And I don't know if that's a benefit to the community per se, because there are so many asks that have come from some of the most vibrant communities and neighborhoods in Toronto that haven't been met. And who's to say that, through a very young program that it will be met with policies that we don't even know what they look like. Are they new policies? Are they, refreshing old ones? Are they remixing some? Like, it's hard to say that there's a benefit coming from this at all.
Danica, appreciate your reporting. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk about it.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that is Danica Samuel, Toronto-based reporter for The Star. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. I'm your host, Adrian Chung. Our This Matters team is me, Adrian Chung, Brian Bradley, JP Fozo, Matt Hearn, Morgan Bachnick, Raju Mudar, Saba Aitazaz, and Sean Patton. Our music is by So Called, Mike DeAngelis, and Sean Patton. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us your comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com/subscribingmatters. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.